Since the end half of the 20th century, the state of Arizona has consistently elected Republican governors, senators, and candidates for president, and has long been regarded as a GOP stronghold. In fact, since the 1948 election, where Arizona went to Harry Truman, the state has only voted for two Democratic Party nominees for president, once in 1996 with Bill Clinton, and again in 2020 with Joe Biden. But other than that, this is a state with a solidly Republican voting record, and up until very recently was a guaranteed state for Republicans on the presidential map. But after the 2016 election, Republicans have failed to win a federal election in the state of Arizona, and ultimately we're going to look at why that's the case and how that will hinder Republicans going into 2024 in an election that they should ultimately win based on the dynamics of this race, but may very well lose because of the trends in the state of Arizona, because Republican voters, independents have been turned away by this modern incarnation of the Republican Party, a Republican Party that is very different from the one that Arizona is used to electing. So we're going to get to all of that in just a sec, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So the state of Arizona, as we pointed out, has been solidly Republican for decades, and beginning in the 1990s, you see very few blue squares in this map here. Even currently, after the 2022 midterms, Republicans still control a majority of House seats in the state of Arizona. They control the state legislature, and they still hold 3 statewide offices. So even despite their losses for governor and Senate, Arizona ultimately sent a split verdict to the rest of the country as to its party preference, which is one of the reasons why I still consider Arizona a purple state, even despite the fact that Republicans haven't won a federal election here since 2016. Now, looking ahead at 2024, we'll take a look at the dynamics of this race before we sort of delve into Arizona's political transformation and why I think it's going to be difficult for Republicans to win the state of Arizona, even with favorable circumstances, because fundamentally there's a shift in Arizona that has been going on for a while that has been accelerated by the past couple of election cycles. So looking at 2024, it's been billed as a three-way race, and so far that's likely to be the case. The likely Democratic nominee is Ruben Gallego, a very progressive member of the House of Representatives. Of course, Kyrsten Sinema is an independent now. She changed her party registration back in December. We made a video about that. She's going to be running as an independent, very likely. And of course, the Republican Party also has a number of candidates that have expressed interest. Of course, Blake Masters, the failed Senate candidate from 2022, might decide to run. Karen Taylor Robson, who lost to Kari Lake in the gubernatorial primary, might run. Kari Lake herself might decide to run. Andy Biggs, Juan Ciscomani are listed as potential. So there's a lot of Republicans that may decide to ultimately end up running in this race. What's striking about the list of interested candidates is that out of the 5 listed here under the publicly expressed interest category, only one of them hasn't lost in election, and that's Mark Lamb, maybe in his previous career, but a major election. Kari Lake obviously lost the governor's race. Blake Masters, Karen Taylor Robson lost the primary, same with Jim Layman. So all of these people have lost elections before. So already, again, many politicians can come back from losing an election, but that's already sort of a hindrance when you've already had a track record of losing in the past. One of the candidates who I think would be Republican strongest is Kimberly Yee, who is the state treasurer who won re-election by around 11 points last November, but she's currently not listed here. I think it's possible that she may decide to run, but she would definitely be the Republicans' best bet. And of course, we take a look at the polling so far in the general election. Of course, Kyrsten Sinema's on this list. Right now, she's polling at around 20%. 15, 39%, whatever the number may be. That's probably going to fall away over time, especially since independent candidates tend to be overestimated in polling. We saw this back in Oregon back in 2022, and ultimately it kind of skewed my prediction on that race because I thought there'd be a larger share of the vote going to Johnson. It turns out she only won about 8%. So Kyrsten Sinema, while she's polling a bit higher now, is likely to do worse than this come election day. If she at all decides to even run, this may not be a three-way race, but right now this is a three-way race. And so far, the polling really only has Kari Lake, Gallego, and Sinema. It doesn't list any of the other Republican candidates. Now, in this three-way matchup, I think Gallego would be the favorite because Sinema would obviously, in my opinion, be taking away a lot more from the Republicans than the Democrats. And there is a large contingent of Republicans, a sizable minority in Arizona, that will vote for people like John McCain, Kimberly Yee, Doug Ducey, but they won't vote for Kari Lake or Donald Trump. And I think that's something that's already going to hurt her, because Kari Lake is a very, very divisive candidate, someone that doesn't really bring people together. And that's one of the reasons why she lost last November. She was running a very base campaign. She was focused only on the base, didn't really focus on reaching independent voters, Democratic voters on the fence. And that's ultimately one of the reasons she lost. So I'm not saying Gallego is that way as well, because he is a very hyper-partisan progressive Democrat. But when you have this sort of matchup, I think somebody like Sinema takes more from Lake than Gallego. And ultimately, I think that would throw the election towards Gallego. Now, again, that's in a Kari Lake scenario. We're a long way off from the 24th Senate race. But I thought it'd be interesting to talk about that right off the bat, because 10% of Republicans voted for Katie Hobbs in the 2020 governor's race, and probably an even larger percentage voted for Kelly. I don't have the exit polls in front of me, but there's a sizable contingent of Republicans that don't like the Trump brand of the party and will always reject it no matter what. Even if they're principally opposed to somebody like Gallego and his policies, they will still vote for him or somebody else over the Republican that's more Trumpian or whatever, for a variety of reasons. Now, looking at Arizona's political history, and again, Arizona was once a very Republican state. Again, back in 2012, Romney won this state by around 9 points. 2016, there's a huge drop-off in support for the Republican candidate. Again, you have Romney winning about 54% of the vote. I don't think this totals the final total, but you have a decent drop-off. Donald Trump only getting 48% of the vote, Hillary Clinton getting about 44%, which is around the number that Obama got back in 2012. The real drop-off was among Republican support in the state of Arizona. Now, I know Arizona has demographic challenges for Republicans. There's larger numbers of voters coming into the state, becoming of voting age, that are less likely to vote Republican, more likely to vote Democrat. But even despite that, Arizona should still be a Republican-leaning state. But because of this transformation that I think accelerated under Trump, that sort of repelled a lot of these suburban center-right voters away from the Republican Party and more into the Democratic fold, you've seen this shift sort of continue and accelerate over time. And of course, Maricopa County, which is the vast majority of Arizona's population, Donald Trump only won that by less than 3 points. He ultimately only won the state by around 3.5%. Fast forward to 2018, Republicans lost a very winnable Senate race, in my opinion. Kyrsten Sinema versus Martha McSally. Martha McSally tried to have it both ways, between being a normie Republican and sort of a Trump Republican, and she tried to balance that image, and ultimately it didn't work. Kyrsten Sinema ended up winning by around 2.5 points. Fast forward again to 2020 with Mark Kelly versus Martha McSally again. Now, the reason she was running was because Ducey appointed her, so she ended up running as an incumbent, but she still lost by the exact same margin, 2.4%, as she did back in 2018. And of course, you saw further shifts to the left in places like Maricopa County, which again is the majority of the population in Arizona. So it's really been a bleed in the suburbs that has hurt Republicans so much. And it's because they're running these candidates that have sort of scared off a lot of moderate center-right voters that, again, would have no problem voting for somebody like John McCain or Doug Ducey, but don't like to vote for these sort of Trump acolytes. And, you know, even back in 2020, it was very clear that after 2016, Trump was going to do worse than he did back in 2016. Again, it was still up in the air as to whether he'd actually win the state narrowly. Again, ultimately in 2020, he lost Arizona only by 0.3%. So it was still incredibly close, even despite these shifts. But the numbers in Maricopa County, Pima County, the most populous parts of the state, were just trending too far away from Republicans. And we could see that best mapped out in this precinct map of Arizona, where you have a lot of these red rural areas that don't really have a whole lot of people in them. And then, of course, you have Phoenix and the Phoenix metro area, which encompasses the vast majority of Maricopa County. And if we look at these shifts from 2016, while downtown Phoenix had a slight shift towards the right, these outer suburbs had pretty large shifts towards Biden, 11 points, 14 points, 9 points, 5 points, so on and so forth. And these numbers, of course, added up to ultimately Donald Trump being the first Republican to lose Arizona since 1996. Now, despite all of this, this was still a pretty narrow defeat for the Republicans. They only lost Arizona by about 0.3%, which is extremely, extremely close. I mean, they lost Pennsylvania by about a point, and that's still an incredibly close race. And, you know, you'd think in 2022, in a year where Republicans would be energized to vote against Biden, the nation would vote against Biden because he was unpopular. A lot of his policies were unpopular. And that ultimately didn't pan out the way Republicans had planned. In fact, Mark Kelly did better than he did in 2020 against Blake Masters, who was a Trump-endorsed candidate. Really wasn't a good fit for the state. He was sort of this Silicon Valley tech guy who, I could make a whole video on his campaign, but essentially his messaging was all over the place, and Mark Kelly had a good entrenched image as this sort of moderate independent senator from Arizona. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter, because that's the way he was portrayed in the election, and he ultimately won at the end of the day because a lot of Arizona voters saw Blake Masters as too extreme for the state, and they saw Mark Kelly as more of a safe option. And we could see that also in the governor's race between Katie Hobbs and Kari Lake. Now, this was a race that I thought was going to go Kari Lake's way. I thought the Arizona Senate race would go Blake Masters' way. But one thing that a lot of people were discounting in the polling, myself included, was sort of this backlash against sort of the Trump brand in the Republican Party. And I really think you started to see it become more obscure and out of the mainstream after the 2020 election, where you had all the 2020 election denialism and stuff like that, which is a very unpopular issue to campaign on. Kari Lake made it a centerpiece of her campaign and ultimately frightened away a lot of these moderate center-right voters we were talking about throughout the video that live in the Phoenix metro area, Pima County, who are Republican voters. They lean Republican. They'll vote Republican down ballot, but they won't vote for somebody like Kari Lake or Donald Trump because, quite frankly, they view them as too extreme. And that's ultimately why Kari Lake lost the governor's race and why Republicans lost Arizona. And as you can see, this is an incredibly close margin. This was a very, very, very winnable race for the Republicans, with somebody like Karen Taylor Robeson or Kimberly Yee or Jim Layman or any of these other Republicans probably would have won this race. But because this brand in particular is so toxic in the state of Arizona, Republicans ended up losing it. So going into 2024, Republicans need to nominate somebody who appeals to their base, somebody who's a conservative Republican, but also doesn't have the optical problems as Kari Lake, somebody who doesn't tell voters who are McCain Republicans not to vote for them, because that's ultimately never a good electoral strategy, no matter what party you're part of, telling people not to vote for you and things of that nature. So Republicans need a polished candidate, somebody who comes out of probably the Maricopa County suburbs, who is still a conservative Republican, but has much better optics, more polished, and is much more refined than a lot of these Trump candidates that have sprung up, especially in the state of Arizona over the past 6 or 7 years, because ultimately it hasn't worked for the Republican Party in the state. They've consistently lost elections on this approach, and even in a three-way race with an independent, I think they're just going to be hurt by that, because Kyrsten Sinema is going to take away more votes from the Republicans. So even if Republicans have a model candidate, I think this will still be a very difficult race for them to win if Sinema is in the race. If it's a Republican versus Gallego race, I think that changes the dynamic quite a bit, especially if you have sort of a Ducey-style Republican going up against Ruben Gallego, who's very progressive, who I think is very out of the mainstream of the state of Arizona. Then it's a much different story. But as the dynamic stands today, I think the Republicans are at a fundamental disadvantage with Sinema in this race, and ultimately, if they want any hope at actually winning this seat in 2024, one, they need a nominee other than Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, because that's going to hurt the down ballot Republican, whoever that is, because Donald Trump, even if he somehow won the presidency, would probably lose the state of Arizona by a couple of points and ultimately drag down whoever the Republican nominee was here. And they would need a candidate that could attract some of these center-right voters who were scared off by Donald Trump, Kari Lake, Blake Masters, Mark Fincham, but would be open to voting for a generic Republican against a very progressive Democrat. And we saw examples of that in 2018. Martha McSally lost by around 2.5 points, despite Doug Ducey at the top of the ticket winning by around 13, 14 percentage points against a very progressive Democrat. So Arizona is still a purple state. One could even argue it's still a lean Republican state, provided you have the right circumstances. But Republicans really need to play their cards right if they're going to pick up this Senate seat come 2024. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Of course, leave a thumbs up down below if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.